She was sold for 30 coins and the promise of silence. Isabela Valbuena watched the metal change hands as if it were a small, forgettable thing, copper glinting in the lamplight like a dishonest sun. Her father counted the coins as though he were balancing a private ledger, his fingers thick with years of wary and tobacco. Her mother folded a handkerchief over her mouth and did not look away. Catalina, her elder sister, had the look of someone who had finished an unfortunate arrangement and was already moving on to the next. In the corner, Don Ramiro's cousin cleared his throat as though to punctuate the transaction with propriety. They did not say the word that would have made it an outrage, sale, because in that house language was a softer kind of violence. It was a sentence disguised as necessity. The debts, the dowry promised to a distant relation, the shame of a failed harvest. Isabela listened to the explanations as she might listen to a sermon she had heard before, the same phrases recycled into justification. At 19, she had learned the art of resignation as if it were a talent her family expected of her. Quiet endurance was a kind of virtue. It had been taught to her in lullabies that folded worry away like a blanket. Her grandmother's lullaby rose in her memory, not as melody but as a small map. She could hum the first thread of it now, the shape of the line, the cadence that rounded itself into patience. It was a voice wartime soft, sown with the smell of rosemary and the warmth of an oven. Isabela carried it as one might carry a small key in a hidden pocket, a private charm against panic. She hummed it once below the din, and the sound surprised her with its steadiness. "Think of it as an arrangement for the household," her mother said, smoothing a sleeve. "Think of the trade. It will secure the rest of us." No one asked if securing the rest meant destroying one. No one, not even Catalina, met Isabela's eyes and called it cruelty. When the carriage came at dawn, it smelled of leather and old rain. The road out of the valley folded into itself. Hawthorn hedges and fields, the chapel spire shrinking behind them. Isabela kept her hands in her lap and watched the familiar parish pass by in rectangles. She counted the places she would miss, not the house exactly, but the loft where winter bread was warmed, the patch of the river where the light gathered like a coin, the low, crooked fig tree that leaned toward the road. She folded those small domestic things into her chest as if they might be nourishment. Mateo rose in her memory, not as melody but as a small map. She could hum the first thread of it now, the shape of the line, the cadence that rounded itself into patience. It was a voice wartime soft, sown with the smell of rosemary and the warmth of an oven. Isabela carried it as one might carry a small key in a hidden pocket, a private charm against panic. She hummed it once below the din, and the sound surprised her with its steadiness. "Think of it as an arrangement for the household," her mother said, smoothing a sleeve. "Think of the trade. It will secure the rest of us." No one asked if securing the rest meant destroying one. No one, not even Catalina, met Isabela's eyes and called it cruelty. When the carriage came at dawn, it smelled of leather and old rain. The road out of the valley folded into itself. Hawthorn hedges and fields, the chapel spire shrinking behind them. Isabela kept her hands in her lap and watched the familiar parish pass by in rectangles. She counted the places she would miss, not the house exactly, but the loft where winter bread was warmed, the patch of the river where the light gathered like a coin, the low, crooked fig tree that leaned toward the road. She folded those small domestic things into her chest as if they might be nourishment. Mateo rode beside the carriage on a piebald horse, head bent under the weight of a ponytail and a genuine, steady loyalty. He was small and unremarkable in the way that men are until they must become more. He had been the stables boy since he could wipe a saddle clean. He had an old debt owed to Alejandro's late father for saving his younger sister from a fever. and debts, in Mateo's estimation, were paid with more than words. He glanced at Isabela once from the horse's back, an exchange like the soft tightening of a rope. He would later say he felt at once protective and impatient, as if a storm were always in his pocket. The manor rose beyond an iron gate like a memory built in stone. Tower Manor's reputation preceded it on the road. Rumors folded into rumor, that Alejandro de la Torre kept to shadow, that he roamed the gardens at night, that he had been changed into something not quite human by grief. The sign carved with the family crest swung with a slow, authoritative creak. The gravel under the carriage whispered like 1,000 small questions. A high wall framed a walled garden, tenacious with ivy and the stubborn green of things that will not submit. Elvira met them with a face merely competent, like a shutter closed against intimacy. The housekeeper's gloves were white and immaculate. Her voice was the voice of rules, measured, unyielding. She led Isabela through corridors that breathed of wax and old paper, past portraits whose eyes followed with the polite accusation of ancestors. They passed a piano lifted high on a landing, its lid shut as if it were hiding a confession. The corridors smelled of dust and candle wax and the thin perfume men wore when they wished to be remembered. Isabela's room was small but dignified, a window with heavy drapes, a washstand, a chair that bore the circular abrasion of many knee pressings. On the sill, a single rose lay in a chipped pottery bowl, a red, leaning thing like a stubborn question. It was surprising and tender, a single bloom in a sculpted world of austerity. Isabela touched its petal and felt the shiver of life in a place that had been given over to protocol and grief. "You will follow the household hours," Elvira said. "You will not enter certain rooms. You will not speak to the master unless he speaks first. You will carry trays when called, and you will keep your eyes low. You are to treat him with discretion," she added, and the word was a kind of judgment. "He requires space." Isabela, who had been taught to make herself small, learned to make room for another smallness as if it were a practice. Her first days were a set of movements, the thermostat of a new life. She rose before the household, she polished the silver in the service hall, she delivered plates on oil-dark trays and withdrew before the weight of any bays could rest on her. She learned the rhythm of the manor as one learns a difficult dance, the click of the servant's footsteps down a corridor, the hush of the library where Don Ricardo signed papers, the way the morning light crawled along the banister and stopped where it met the piano. The master of the house did not appear in the parlor. He appeared in a window. Alejandro occupied a room whose shutters were bars held together by wood. From the long dining hall, she could see him at a distance through the mullioned glass, a shadow in a chair, a hand folded into the air. He did not hail the servants. He did not call for company. The household spoke of him in half-sentences and euphemisms. Not well, still mourning, needs his rest, that made the center of the house a place of hush and haloed rumor. Children were told he was a scare if they did not return their supper plates. Adults called him an unfortunate man cut off by grief. Isabela watched him as one watches a bird that will not come to the feeder. He had the high-reined look of someone who has been forced into the narrowness of habit. His hair lay like dark ash against his temples. His shoulders were the slope of someone who had begun to allow the world's weight to press him down into furniture. His eyes, when they turned, were not vacant. They were a map of something lost. She began with the small things. On the third morning, she slipped into the walled garden under the pretense of fetching a sprig of rosemary for the kitchen. The garden, a place that might once have held laughter and the measured pleasures of a family that trusted each other, was now a collection of small defeats. Path overgrown, statues with lichen crusted like sleep, a sundial with its face slightly askew. But in the far corner, guarded by a broken stone bench, a single rose bush fought the air. One blossom clung to a stem like a small red torch. Isabela knelt and held the rose as if it were a letter. The petals had a velvet that felt improbable in the climate of the place. She whispered to it the things she had once whispered into her grandmother's apron. The names of the clouds, the feel of river stones, the tune she hummed at night when hunger scraped at the children in the village. A humming comes from the throat and travels outward. It is less a proof of talent than evidence of survival. She did not think of her action as brave. Courage at home had been a big theatrical word for those who owned law and land. Her acts were smaller: a displaced kindness, a borrowed phrase, a hand placed on the back of a chair to steady someone who did not seem to need steadiness. She spoke to the air as she turned back toward the house, more to maintain her own voice than to invite conversation. Yet as she crossed the gravel, she felt the faintest shift from the shadow of the manor. A curtain at a second-floor window had been pulled aside and then pulled back. It might have been a trick of the breeze. It might have been a man remembering to look. She started to leave a slice of bread on the sill near his window, then a cup of broth on the landing when she was sure the household's movement allowed it. The rules did not forbid such things explicitly, and Elvira kept her gaze on the formal, trays passed, corners unmarked. But there is a place where rules meet the frailty of habit and bend. Isabela learned how to carry a tray with the kind of carefulness that announces nothing, then places everything: a cup, a small napkin folded twice, a piece of bread. She left the tray, the metal footstep muffled by the rug, and withdrew as if a ghost. At first, there was no response, only the soft echo that comes when a room releases itself. Once, early in the afternoon, she heard a sound like a cloth dragged across wood. She had tucked the rosary between two pillows and thought she'd imagined it until a voice, one syllable and small as a bird, asked, "Who?" She froze. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. "My name is Isabela," she said aloud, and the syllables were a small and honest thing. "I am from the Valbuena household." Later, she wondered whether she had trespassed into a unique kind of danger by naming herself, but in that instant it felt like a bridge. It is a curious thing, speaking to someone who is not expected to answer, as if the world redraws its map because two coordinates have been declared. Alejandro did not come to the window. He spoke once, low and raw, as if the words were rasped from the inside of him. Why? It was not a question of curiosity, but the sharper kind of question that looks at need and asks for a reason to continue. Isabela could have answered with the kinds of rationalizations her family fed to the world: necessity, duty, a strange and useful obedience, but the lullaby turned in her throat and something simpler came out. "Because no one should suffer alone," she said. The voice that spoke then was quieter, and for the first time she heard a breath rearrange itself on the other side of the glass. A day later, a small hand, pale and long-fingered, reached toward the sill, as if to accept the cup she left, and the tray remained on the threshold like a covenant. Rumor hardened in the manor like lime mortar. Servants whispered behind elbows. Don Ricardo, who walked like a man who believed words were property, watched from his paper-strewn study with the interest of a man measuring odds. There were rumors he liked: that Alejandro's father had buried secrets in his ledgers, that advantage is a kind of religion, and men like Don Ricardo were its priests. Whenever he visited, and he visited with a clinical regularity, his shoes polished so the floor registered him with a small and accusatory echo, he kept his tone of voice like a knife wrapped in silk. He spoke of accounts and concern, offered advice about restoring health to a household in decay. He had the look of a man who has long ago learned how to make people feel themselves culpable by simply pointing to a ledger. Isabela saw Don Ricardo once at a distance, a man who carried the smell of paper and cigar smoke. He was not loud. Men like him prefer to control the world with soft hands, because soft hands slow suspicion. He had a habit of pressing his thumb on the rim of a glass and then withdrawing it as if testing the ripeness of a fruit he intended to harvest. Rumor hardened in the manner like lime mortar. Servants whispered behind elbows. Don Ricardo, who walked like a man who believed words were property, watched from his paper-strewn study with the interest of a man measuring odds. There were rumors he liked, that Alejandro's father had buried secrets in his ledgers, that advantage is a kind of religion, and men like Don Ricardo were its priests. Whenever he visited, and he visited with a clinical regularity, his shoes polished so the floor registered him with a small and accusatory echo, he kept his tone of voice like a knife wrapped in silk. He spoke of accounts and concern, offered advice about restoring health to a household in decay. He had the look of a man who has long ago learned how to make people feel themselves culpable by simply pointing to a ledger. Isabela saw Don Ricardo once at a distance, a man who carried the smell of paper and cigar smoke. He was not loud. Men like him prefer to control the world with soft hands, because soft hands slow suspicion. He had a habit of pressing his thumb on the rim of a glass and then withdrawing it as if testing the ripeness of a fruit he intended to harvest. To Isabela, he seemed less a monster invented in the village tales than a bureaucrat of cruelty, a man who keeps other people's suffering neatly accounted for and whose ledger always shows profit when others show pain. Mateo, for his part, watched the house with an impatience that was a kind of tenderness. He had a way of stopping to look at the stable's door as if it were a hearth from his childhood. He would sometimes speak in the kitchen about the late master, Alejandro's father, as a man who had shown him mercy once and thus had an unreturnable debt. He kept an eye on the household movements, on the manner in which Elvira snapped her hands when she wanted silence, and how Don Ricardo's visits coincided with the notice of certain payments in red ink. Closer to the heart of the house, Isabela's connection with Alejandro moved like the slow thaw of winter on a stone. It did not seem like much to the household, a woman who set a cup on a ledge, who hummed while she shelled peas in the back kitchen, who straightened a pillow as if giving order to the small things a man could not sustain alone. But small acts are accumulative. They hang on a person the way dew hangs on a leaf, neither startling nor decisive by themselves. They so often come to mean everything. Isabela found ways to make the house softer that had nothing to do with flattery. She read aloud scraps from the newspapers that lay damp in corners, so the sound of words filled the silence. She sang beneath the door when storm nights pressed the windows. She washed plates with a deliberation that made water sound like a hymn. The real tool she had, though, was steadiness, an unremarkable, stubborn face to difficulty that by its repetition changed the geography of the place. Steadiness is not the same as fearlessness. It is a refusal to let fear own the hour. Alejandro's first rebounds were not grand gestures. He began to leave his window a fraction more often, his profiles appearing at the edge of doors as if curiosity were on its feet. Once, at a distance across the dining room, he drew his fingers across the face of the piano. He did not play a tune that resolved into melody. Rather, he skimmed the surface of sound like a man who had not yet learned whether his hands belonged to music or to the past. One afternoon in late autumn, a storm took the sky. Rain came from a low ceiling of cloud, as if the heavens had developed a long, patient grievance. The household tightened its routine into the small comfort of predictable motions. The sturdier servants hurried to shutter windows. Elvira counted lamps. Servants crossed the hallways with bundled shoulders. The sound of chairs scraping became a measured percussion. In the master's wing, a change came like the first sharp note of a broken instrument. A cry went through the house with the quickness of a snapped thread. It was not a shout as a village might make it. It was a noise that held torment in its shape, something stripped from the ribs of the place. The staff paused, a frozen choreography of heads turning. Isabela felt the sound like a shiver in the bones. She had been folding napkins in the scullery, her hands wet and fragrant with soap. The rhythm of her work was the sort that clears thinking space. She could have followed the rule: remain unseen, remain useful in the kitchen, do not interfere with what is not yours. Many a woman had been spoken of as meddlesome for simply being compassionate. She felt the old hand of caution wrap around her, the memory of family dinners where she was praised for staying unobtrusive. But the lullaby that was a map in her chest rose again, like a fox dug from the earth. There is a point in every small life where the accumulation of tiny acts demands it be acknowledged. It will ask you to step beyond a boundary because the alternative is to let another person remain in a kind of slow absence. She crossed the corridor without the permission she should have waited for and climbed the stair whose wood knew the footfalls of those who do not ask. When she reached the heavy door of the master's room, it was half open, and the room smelled of cold metal and damp curtains. Candles guttered in sconces. The piano lid stood open like a small grave. Alejandro was inside, not a presence at the window, but in the center of the room, his shoulders heaving. He had pulled a blanket around him, and his hands were fists on the fabric, knuckles white. The storm threw its own frenzy against the panes, and every clap of thunder seemed to press the man's chest down further. Isabela's first instinct was to scoot to the piano bench to close the lid. Her second was to stand in the doorway and leave if anyone told her that she was impertinent. But when he turned his face and their eyes met, his look was not something directed at her as an object. It was a desperate and slightly embarrassed plea. There is a moment in which grief chooses a witness, and he looked as if he had been waiting for someone to witness the things that usually go unremarked. She took one step forward until the floor no longer hummed with the sound of merciless rules. She sat on the bench, though she could not play, and she began to sing. The lullaby flowed out of her in a voice that was not trained, but was honest. It was the song of her grandmother, a compass tune to patience. The room was full of the storm's percussion, and her small melody tried to shape itself into a shelter. It was not an attempt to fix, it was an offering of presence, an answer to the sharpness of the howl. She sang about small things, a river stone that kept its roundness, a fig tree that bent back toward sunlight, a mother who mended clothes by lamplight. Her voice, ordinary and human, met his like two hands finding one another in the dark. At first, he continued to breathe as though someone had nudged an ancient engine. Then his shoulders loosened by the measure of an inch, his fists unclenched. The sound he made then was not a return to speech so much as a surrender to the fact of being seen. Tears that had hardened like resin upon him broke and found paths down his cheeks. He let them fall without apology. When he asked the question, it was simple, and the thing that divides blame from truth was the way it trembled. Why did you come? Isabela rested her palms on the piano lid, the wood warm from the recent touch of hands. She answered not with the practical reasons her family had given, but with a truth that did not demand gratitude. Because no one should suffer alone, she repeated. It was not a proclamation, but a small policy. She would be a witness to his unmaking and his possible return. For the first time, inside the man no one would visit, a conversation opened in soft, grated tones. He told her about his father in fragments, a ledger passed from hand to hand, a ledger heavy with entries that smelled of money and secrecy. A funeral that had been bright but hollow. A man, Don Ricardo, who had come not with condolence but with offers. He spoke without accusation. He spoke as if summoning the past had cost him so much that keeping his voice low was the only affordable thing. Isabela listened, the way one does when someone tries to rebuild a house whose beams are rotten. She did not offer judgments. She offered presence and the occasional fact, which is one of the most substantial kinds of help. She told him about small ministrations, the way steam rose off a kettle, how in her village the rain sometimes spoke to people and told them to be bold. She repeated the lullaby at intervals, as if the refrain might stitch together a torn garment. There was no instantaneous transformation. There was, instead, the gradual reweaving of words into trust. From the hallway came the sound of steps, the purposeful, neat steps of Don Ricardo returning from the town with a sealed envelope and an air of business. He would, in his way, be the axis of many misfortunes to come. A man who had learned to calculate advantage as one might tally harvests. A man who saw grief as opportunity. For now, he would be a shadow at the edge of a developing story. In the kitchen, plates were still steaming. In the garden, the rose still held its day's dew. The house did not know yet how precarious the small warmth would prove. When Isabela left the room that first night, she did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter, a bruise of hope that had not yet swelled into conviction. She walked the corridor as if stepping back into a life she had been given rather than chosen. Her palms smelled of candle wax. Her throat hummed the last line of the lullaby, as if to remind her of a vow. Mateo waited by the stairs, his face full of questions that he kept to practical matters, whether she had permission, whether Elvira had noted the breach, whether Don Ricardo's mood might sour. "Quiet as a mouse, mind," Mateo whispered, though he did not mean it as reprimand. He meant only to supply the small cloak of caution the house demanded. She nodded, aware of the pull between secrecy and necessity. Courage is never a pure flame. It fidgets where the wind of consequence breathes by. The small hope that had been born in the master's chamber now had to be stored, tended, and quietly fed. In the weeks that followed, they built a language of glances and small acts. Isabela learned which afternoon the master preferred his tea, and she timed the tray with a care that looked ordinary. She left a book with its pages mildly damp with the scent of rain because she suspected a man who lived through papers might appreciate a different texture. Once, she risked leaving a scrap of poetry folded into the pocket of a coat he would later wear, simple lines about light and the audacity of endurance, because she did not know how else to say what her hands were beginning to feel. Alejandro, for his part, offered the beginnings of small remitments. He began to place his hand on the sill in a way that suggested curiosity rather than defense. He would ask now and then for the names of things in her voice, and she would answer with the gentle precision of someone who knows how to make small things hold. "That is a cloud shaped like a loaf," she'd say. "That is a swallow's flight." He would, half an hour later, hum a fragment of a bar he chose from the piano, like someone learning to reclaim a limb. Outside, life continued its usual accounting. Don Ricardo's visits became the sort that left the household colder for days afterward. He did not shout. He suggested changes that always seemed to benefit the man holding the ledger. He would, innocently and not, adjust lines of credit, argue that certain lands be sold, suggest that certain servants were superfluous. He smiled as a margin of profit might smile, bland, exact, and thin. Mateo watched with a watchfulness that had roots in loyalty and in the faint burn of a promise kept. He had a sister who had married poorly and a memory of a harvest that had once been generous in a house other than his own. He had watched Alejandro's father offer him a job when the boy was a youth. He kept track of movements and of the nights in which Don Ricardo's carriage left at odd hours. He observed in ways that were neither heroic nor spectacular, but steady as a stitch. He learned to bring news to Isabela either by word or by the small placement of bread in places that would be found at the right hour. In the servants' pantry, gossip made the rounds like cheap sherry. People dressed their fear in the syntax of rumor. They said the house used to be warm. They said the master would not have needed this if only the heirs had been less some of sorrow. But in the pantry, where onions dried and knives hung with a long patience, a woman named Pilar, who had once nursed a baby through an impossible winter, looked at Isabela as if she had seen an uncommon thing. "She's not weak," Pilar whispered once, pressing a towel on a pot. "She's stubborn in a kind way." Isabela thought of the word until it felt like a small armor. She had been taught humility as a kind of necessity. She had practiced it so deeply that to see it called weakness by her family had become a common fracture. In the quiet of the pantry, she felt a small, private correction. Strength could be unassuming without losing its force. The days folded into a pattern, and that pattern made small space for a plan, though neither she nor Alejandro named it as such yet. She learned to listen for the crack in the ledger, little tells that suggested the house's financial report was not entirely honest. A receipt misfiled, a servant overhearing Don Ricardo's words about an account, a ledger left open and forgotten for a moment. These things gathered like scraps on a table until they hinted at a story. Isabela found herself reading small entries in the ledger when she had reason to tidy the study. Notes scrawled in a hand that made numbers look like constellations. A payment here, a discharge there, and an odd notation in the margin that suggested transfers being masked as maintenance. It was not definitive. It was the kind of thing a clever man in Don Ricardo's place could explain away with the smoothness of a button. But it was enough to seed a suspicion. Suspicion is the beginning of inquiry. Even as she began to think of evidence and ledger lines, she kept her work at the level of human repairs, coaxing a man back into speech, teaching him how to make a tea that tasted of honey, putting a blanket over a chair in the damp morning when he forgot warmth. Alejandro, the voice, when it came, was built of shards, fragments of memory and reluctant humor that had been hoarded like a miser keeps coins. He told her once about a ledger and how his father had asked him to keep accounts as if the paper were a thing that could hold responsibility properly. "My father believed in accounts," he said, touching the corner of an imaginary page. "He believed a ledger could make the world honest." "And did it?" Isabela asked. He looked at her as if astonished that she would ask such a direct question. "Not always," he admitted. "But perhaps a ledger can confess if a man learns to read it aloud." Her laugh at that moment was almost a sound of relief. They were both practicing small catharses. She could smell the rain from the window where she stood. He could feel the warmth of her presence like a thin scarf against an exposed throat. They had not the language of a conspiracy yet. They had instead the private architecture of a trust, the placement of a cup in a certain hour, the sharing of a memory, the recognition of a ledger left open just a fraction too long. It was only when the wind rubbed the corners of the house raw and a smell of smoke from a distant chimney reached the manor that they both sensed the border of what had been merely personal and what might be communal. A house keeps its secrets well. It keeps them in the way rooms hide in each other. To find a room's secret is often to become its custodian. Isabela understood in that hush that she was building something she could not on her own account for. Her small courage had made her a keeper of a fragile trust. The man everyone feared, who had been wrapped in hush and rumor, had begun, slowly and with startling gentleness, to return to himself. She had not performed a miracle. She had, with unremarkable steadiness, made herself into the sort of person who would not let him stay in the sediment of grief. On an evening when the moon hid behind a gauze of cloud and the house settled against a silence, Isabella sat at the far end of the hall and watched the glow of a single candle in a window upstairs. She hummed the lullaby as if to answer the house with a soft insistence. The melody was a string that, once plucked, held a room together. It was not heroism. It was not even boldness. It was the small, continual thing that, over time, fashions the world into something else. From the room came a sound she had not expected, a tentative, uneven chord from the piano. It was less a performance than an attempt. When the chord resolved into another and then another, something in the house shifted. Even the portraits seemed to look less like stern judges and more like observers who had been given a new story to consider. Isabella smiled to herself in the dim. For a long time, she had thought of her life as a path decreed by others. Now she had the sensation of being in the middle of a map she had not drawn, but which she was beginning to navigate. The rose in the garden, the lullaby in her throat, the ledger's quiet confessions, all of it made a pattern that suggested the possibility of return. She had not yet imagined the danger that would come with such an attempt. She had not yet tasted the full private cruelty of a man who hides his ambition beneath the soft glove of advice. The house, for now, offered only small recompenses. A note tucked into a pocket, a hand held against a sleeve, a look across the piano that meant more than any table-turned condemnation. As the piano's low notes lingered, Alejandro spoke from the room above in a voice that was more present than absent. "Stay," he said. It was the first command he had given her that was not a rebuke and not a plea. It was a small act of claiming, and when she did not move, when she sat quietly and simply kept watch, he returned to the keys and played something that sounded, in its awkwardness, like hope learning to stand. Outside, beyond the manor's wall, the night folded itself in the way it always had. Inside, two people who had been measured by others' accounts, one as weak, one as dangerous, were beginning to make a different accounting. One was giving steadiness, the other was receiving it, and for the first time in years, letting it change him. In the kitchen below, Mateo put a kettle on the stove and listened to the sound that rose like a promise through the floor. He felt the weight of his decision to help thrumming under his rib cage like a distant hoof. There would be practicalities to speak of. There would be ledgers to examine, and perhaps a legal figure to whom men must speak when they wish to undo a wrong. For now, though, he poured the tea with hands that shook only slightly, and he labeled the day in his mind as the beginning of something that might, if they were careful, be called a rescue. Outside the manor gates, under the watch of the single rosebush and the low moon, Isabella thought of her family's hands counting coins in the lamplight. She thought of the way her mother's mouth had tightened when the carriage door closed. She thought of Catalina's quick succession of events: marry, secure, move on. She felt an odd small pity for the people who had sold her out of necessity and fear. Pity in the sense that small-mindedness finds its only refuge in immediate advantage. She felt no vengeance. She felt a larger determination, which is to say, a plan not of retribution, but of restoration. If she could coax a man back from the brink of his private ruin, could she not also coax the truth into being the way a gardener coaxes a plant through winter? She was, she understood, no heroic figure lit by destiny. She was modest and human and oddly persistent. The world would name her weakness because it found so few women made of the same quiet stuff. That was their mistake. When he asked her the question that would come to sit in the center of their conversations, why,
Again and again in small, startling forms, she would answer always with the same thing: because no one should suffer alone. The words were not a script, but a creed. They would do as much to open a ledger as they would to hold a hand. They would make a key out of nothing but patience and a single red rose. Rain began again around the manor, the sky scraping its throat with long, wet fingers. Inside, a piano chord lingered like a promise half-kept. Outside, Don Ricardo's lamps burned on in their study, the papers around him like a small blizzard of profit.
Inside the house, someone who had once been declared weak was meeting the need of someone the world had been taught to fear. And somewhere between the soot and the sugar, a plan was beginning to draw itself, slow as seamwork, sharp as a needle. Isabela set her hands in her lap and hummed the lullaby as if it were a spell she did not understand but had faith in. The house listened. Alejandro leaned his head toward the sound and allowed himself to be steadied like a man taking measure of a possibility he had not thought he deserved. Outside, the rose held its weight against the wind and did not break. The days after the lullaby lived inside the house like something newly planted. At first, barely noticeable, then demanding water. Isabela discovered how small disturbances could rearrange a household. A cup set on the sill at the right hour could invite a conversation. The careful folding of a napkin could read as an act of care rather than servitude. She learned the slow business of reading a man whose sorrow made him exacting and brittle. Alejandro, for his part, began to speak in fragments that were not quite sentences, as if language needed to be coaxed back into its limbs. He would tell a story and stop, then ask for the last line of a poem she had tucked into a coat pocket. He would laugh in a way that surprised him, and then, embarrassed, ask what had made him do it. Their private progress resembled a patient mending, stitches taken when a seam begged, and the needle returned again to make sure it held. She taught him how to hold a cup without gripping it as though it were a bargaining chip. He taught her a chord on the piano, an awkward thing that resolved into a sound like an ox being reintroduced to sunlight. On mornings when fog hung like a dull veil over the garden, they sat near the window and read aloud from small books he still kept despite the dust. He liked an old geography text that spoke in crisp typed letters of far-off coasts. She liked a collection of folk sayings that treated endurance as a craft. The study where the ledger lived was a shrine to paper. Don Ricardo kept ledgers in a way priests keep reliquaries, with gloves and a kind of hunger. When he left his papers, it was only for a single breath, and Isabela had watched, with a steady curiosity, the balance between what he thought secure and what was not. It was in the margin of one of those days, him absent for an afternoon call, and the study left open for a brief, impossible moment, that Isabela noticed a small misfile. A receipt, tucked where the hush of the ledger should have been, hinted at transfers marked maintenance that matched payments Mateo had observed leaving the stable accounts. Mateo, who had the look of a man who keeps promises by remembering the exact number of a debt, became a quiet architect of their designs. He had his own reasons for wanting the house to be honest beyond loyalty to Alejandro's father. When he was a child, the late master had given him a blanket when winter nearly took his sister. The memory had been a small miracle, no legal obligation, only the human thing of mercy, and it had lodged in him like a stone keeps the imprint of a foot. He watched Don Ricardo's neat hand signing lines with the thin, satisfied smile of a clerk who has always been a step ahead. He rode back to the stables and returned to Isabela with observations that were not heroic but precise. Times when the carriage left in its direction, the maid who had counted less bread at table on certain nights, a ledger entry seen in haste when a footman had dropped a folder.
Together, Isabela and Mateo conspired with the kind of intimacy that does not require romance, two people aligning the small mechanics of courage. They arranged to have Isabela tasked with occasional dusting of the study, which gave her the chance to touch a corner of the room that otherwise kept its distance from servants. She began to memorize certain pages of the ledger, not out of grandiosity, but because memory is a kind of insurance when one cannot assume documents will remain safe. Alejandro, when he realized how his uncle regarded him, began to read aloud from entries he recalled with the kind of tenderness a man assigns to maps that tell where he has been robbed. Their plan matured slowly and with prudence. They would not take recklessness for courage. Isabela practiced the hush of steps across the hall. Mateo rehearsed routes and times as if he were arranging a relay. Alejandro, once he felt steadier enough to risk exposure, opened his desk at a time when Don Ricardo was known to be at Mass. He wrote with the care of a man returning letters to a lost friend. He transcribed, by the light of a single candle, the dates and amounts that did not belong in a gentleman's ledger. He wrote the names of contractors and the references to the maintenance that had a too specific ring. He kept the handwriting close to his fingers, as if by the ink smell the man could be found again. The night they chose was one with a moon that hid behind its sleeve of cloud. Fog lay low and made the gravel of the drive rubbery and soft. Elvira had gone to bed with the precision of a watch and a temperature, confident in the rules she had set, convinced no servant would break the system she administered. The house slept in its usual divisions, the warm common rooms and the colder private wings, the kitchen breathing steam into cupboards while lamps burned in measured coin. Isabela moved through the study door with the sort of deliberate lightness that had been practiced into muscle memory. Her heart kept a measured pace, not the wild staccato of fear, but the resolute drum of someone who understood that the smallest tremor of haste would ruin everything. The room smelled of old leather and the faint citrus of ink. The ledger sat where Don Ricardo had left it, the corners slightly worn from use. A candle guttered nearby, throwing its small, loyal light. Alejandro had his own burden to carry. He knew his uncle's routines, but he could not predict every weather. He had the diary hidden beneath a false bottom in a drawer, but wanted to take it out into the open and read it where someone could listen and make use of the truth. The plan had been crafted by the slow arithmetic of trust. Isabela would fetch a tray with tea and stand in the doorway. Alejandro would draw the ledger from the drawer and begin to copy those entries that mattered most, the ones that would show a pattern of siphoning. Mateo would wait in the shadows near the garden wall in case they needed him to distract or fetch a missing item. Isabela felt, as she lifted the tray, the old lesson from childhood: how to make one's hands steady when others measure them for weakness. She walked with the tray as if the teapot were an actual heart she carried, careful not to jostle the kettle. Her shadow moved along the floorboards like a second, quieter person who would not betray her. She set the tray down and, as arranged, let her eyes linger on the ledger visible on the desk. The plan had afforded them a swatch of time, but the house has, of its own will, a habit of disarranging plans. The hinge of the corridor gave a sound like a throat clearing. Isabela's breath hitched. She thought the noise might be Elvira, but it was a foot that did not belong in the sequence they had expected. A servant came along the hall, a young woman new to the house who had been sent to fetch a curtain tie. Isabela's hand brushed the edge of the desk to steady herself, and for a moment the world narrowed to the color of the ledger spine and the smallness of an accidental glance. The servant paused and frowned, the way people do when the air in a room does not match what they expect. Isabela smiled and spoke in the gentle, practiced voice that had become her armor. "Good night," she said, and the word was a small bar of soap that cleaned the moment. The servant nodded and passed, leaving Isabela's pulse to find a calmer rhythm. Inside the drawer, the diary waited like a sleeping thing, bound in leather that had been softened by years of thumbed pages. Alejandro's hands were not the stereotyped hands of a frightened man. They were capable and precise. They had worked with the ledger before, with the same kind of reverence a person has for the bones of their life. He pulled out a page and smoothed it as if it were a map worth unfolding. When their hands met, briefly, an accidental brush as they both leaned to steady the spine, neither of them laughed nor looked away. It was a small contact, but because the house had taught them to be careful, it felt like the crossing of two borders.
His thumb found a page and flipped. Then his features did something slow and steady that chilled Isabela more than his brief words. He smiled as a man who feels himself victorious at the precise moment the pieces fall his way. "What is this?" he asked, but he did not ask for an answer. He already knew the line he would take. He would remove ambiguity by making the accusation fit like a custom glove. "Isabela," he said, turning with an ease that suggested long practice, "you were foolish to be in here." His voice was a litmus for the room. Elvira, who had been listening in the shadow of the doorway, emerged with a face like a folded napkin, righting herself with the duty of a woman whose life had been ordered by rules. She did not look at Isabela with warmth. She looked at her with the mechanical comprehension of an interpreter. "You have overstepped," she said. "You know the rules." Isabela found herself saying, in a voice that did not wobble, though her hands trembled beneath the fold of her apron, "I was helping him." "For what?" Don Ricardo asked. "To make trouble? To stir unrest? To tempt fate?" His questions were rhetorical. They were weeds meant to choke the small garden they had planted. He lifted his hand, and the ledger's front cover opened like a maw. His fingers went to the corner of a page, and with the cool decisiveness of someone burning an accounting, he tore a strip from the margin and tucked it into his sleeve. A clerkly, everyday motion, nothing theatrical, turned into a small theft. Isabela, whose face had been for weeks a study in compact restraint, felt fury like a small animal in her chest. It had not been feeding, but it had not been dead. She moved forward, not with physical force, but with a kind of moral stride, and said plainly, "Those pages are not yours to take." Don Ricardo turned then with the strangest, almost amused look. "They are part of the house's accounts," he said, "and I am the steward of the estate." He seemed to believe his own mask. "You will return the page you took and go back to your duties." Isabela's jaw locked. She could have argued, but the house taught caution like a hymn. She had not prepared herself to be a loud woman in the face of a quiet man who had practiced soft cruelty for years. Instead, she moved with the only tactic she had, a very slight, very deliberate reach into her apron, where the copied pages lay hidden, and the fingers who had learned stitches and small tasks found a sure route. Before her hand could reveal herself, Don Ricardo stepped closer and snatched at the fold of her apron as if swatting at a moth. In the tug, the transcription unfolded and a scrap fluttered to the floor. A jagged corner of the ledger, one they had not yet copied, landed near the hearth. For a sliver of a second, their plan was raw and visible. Don Ricardo's face folded into a smile that was not humor, but triumph. He picked up the scrap and, with a small, private flourish, brought it to the fire. Paper curls and blackens quickly in a hearth tended by a man who has done such work before. The strip of evidence burned with an ordinary efficiency, thin as a thing discarded, as if the house knew how to consume its own history. Alejandro moved then, but not with violence. He moved with a dignity that belonged to the idea of a man reclaiming himself. He reached for the other pages, intending to hold them up, to show what Don Ricardo was trying to erase. Don Ricardo's hand, quick, decisive, closed over the diary. There was a small struggle of wrists, a sound like a cloth dragged across wood, and then the ledger was in his control.
He crushed it as one might the last hope of a person who had forgotten how to be generous. "Enough," Don Ricardo said. The single word did the heavy work of many accusations. He held the diary and turned the pages like a magistrate examining a failed witness. The room had the shape of an altar, and he, the priest, decided to excommunicate. That night, the house shifted toward its darker gravity. Don Ricardo did not call for the constable, as men of his class sometimes do. He used instead the architecture available to him: the hidden door behind a stack of papers, the cellar with its low mouth and smell of earth and old stone. In a gesture that was as efficient as it was cruel, he ordered Alejandro to the basement with a voice like a man who disciplines a child. It was not the voice of a man who wanted to hurt, but of a man who needed to control the truth. The servants, disciplined by habit and the fear of homicide that can be exacted by a ledger, did not protest. Isabela found herself expelled from the house by the same hands that had once placed a tray at the window. Don Ricardo declared her a thief and a troublemaker, with the certainty of a man who has spent his life shaping narratives into law. He instructed drivers to take her back to her family, and he added, with the casual cruelty of somebody who knows public opinion's appetite, that she must be left there in disgrace. Her family received her return as a bright, inconvenient object. Catalina's face, practiced in the art of immediate recovery, hardened into the expression of someone who had never been entrusted with a secret. Her mother wept at first, then tightened her hands as if the shame could be hidden in the knit of them. Don Ramiro ducked his head and made a small speech about the burdens of propriety. In their eyes, Isabela had become, once more, the thing they had traded to survive. In the village, she was treated with the kind of polite cruelty that sells rumors. Children who had once played by the river shrank away. The men in the square nodded as if to say a necessary thing. The women, always the first to land a rumor and the last to let it go, whispered with the exactness of a chorus. She was taken by Don Ricardo as punishment, they said. She stole, she betrayed. The narrative fit the shape of a house needing to make a scapegoat.
Isabela, who had been practicing the quiet forms of courage for months now, felt her resilience tested. The shame had color and texture. It sat on her shoulders like an ill-fitting cloak. She had not expected to be thrown back to the world so quickly, and for the first time since leaving the Valbuena house, she tasted the bitter tang of humiliation that is meant to teach women where to remain. But she had not, in the short weeks of the manor's quiet work, lost the small things she had learned there. Her hand still remembered the lullaby's cadence. Her vision still held the image of the rose, stubborn in its corner of stone. Even in the village, as tongues turned and people shook their heads in that exact way, she held the little list she had transcribed close to her body. It was hidden and safe, folded into a place where clothes and shame could not reach it. It felt, in that place, like a secret treasure. Meanwhile, in the manor's basement, Alejandro found himself reduced to a small room lit by a single oil lamp. The stone was cold and the air smelled like damp. There was no theatrics in his imprisonment. It was as if the house had simply pressed him into a different problem, one that involved fewer witnesses and more dark. But confinement did not make him smaller. If anything, the narrowness shaped a steadier instrument of will. He was visited that night by a single ray of news. Mateo, faithful like a dog and inventive like a fox, had contrived to leave a token, a scrap of cloth with a note, for him. The note was a thread of hope. Do not despair. Help is being sought. Mateo's handwriting was quick and practical and had an authority that made Alejandro feel less alone.
The stable boy had found a friend in Don Emilio de Velasco, a man of law whose loyalty to the late master had been known more in small circles than in public proclamations. Mateo had ridden in the night to find him. Alejandro, constrained though he was, took refuge in motion of a different kind. He wrote. He wrote until his ink was exhausted, and then he scratched with charcoal on the corner of an old ledger, and then, with the help of a contraband pencil smuggled by Mateo, he wrote more. He wrote not only a plea, but a record, dates, names, the timing of strange payments. He wrote down the moments he had known in his bones to be wrong, and he attached them to moments of proof, witnesses the house could not entirely erase. He asked Mateo, when the boy could approach the unpredictable boundary between house and outside, to speak to Don Emilio and to carry what he had written. Alejandro, constrained though he was, took refuge in motion of a different kind. He wrote. He wrote until his ink was exhausted, and then he scratched with charcoal on the corner of an old ledger, and then, with the help of a contraband pencil smuggled by Mateo, he wrote more. He wrote not only a plea, but a record, dates, names, the timing of strange payments. He wrote down the moments he had known in his bones to be wrong, and he attached them to moments of proof, witnesses the house could not entirely erase. He asked Mateo, when the boy could approach the unpredictable boundary between house and outside, to speak to Don Emilio and to carry what he had written. Isabela, exiled and furious in the quiet way of a person whose heart is not brittle but persistent, did not sink. She cultivated her small resistance like a gardener tends a bed in winter. Her mother watched her with a mixture of discomfort and relief, thinking perhaps that sending her home had been a prudent act.
Isabela used the time to mend a dress, a thought, a memory, while the world gossiped and tried to decide whether it had witnessed wrongdoing or merely the necessary trade the village's survival required. Her body bore the marks of public shaming, but her interior life fortified itself with the knowledge that truth could be tended and preserved. Mateo arrived at dawn with news that felt like a blade of light. Don Emilio, who lived in a town 2 days' ride away and whose respectability made him a figure of quiet power, had agreed to help. He believed, with the resolute rationality of a jurist, in papers and in signatures. He recognized that ledger entries could become instruments of legal recourse if properly verified. He also recognized, with a faintness of feeling that had nothing to do with law, that Alejandro de la Torre had been wronged. Don Emilio was not a man given to dramatic displays. He wore his coat like a curtain, and his hands had the patient motions of someone used to unwrapping facts. He listened to Mateo's hurried rendering of events in a small room of his office, then sent for permits and notes and the slow machinery of law. He did not promise an instant triumph. He promised instead the kind of methodical work that makes justice possible. Back at the manor, Don Ricardo's victory felt almost complete. He had the diary's fewer pages in his possession, and he brandished their partial destruction like a proof that discipline had been administered. He set himself up as the voice of calm in a household that suddenly needed one. He spoke to servants about loyalty and to neighbors about the difficulties of maintaining an estate bound in debt. His smile was tidy, his pronouncements apologetic in tone yet precise. He loved the architecture of reason. He loved it because it made his cruelty look like prudence. But men built their schemes on the assumption that everything will stay quiet, and the world is noisier than men like Don Ricardo prefer. Mateo, in his loyalty, had seen more than numbers. He had seen the way Don Ricardo slipped receipts into a false ledger, the way his coachman took a different route back to town on certain nights, the way an envelope with a wax seal had been exchanged at dusk. Mateo had a network of small debts, and he used them like a net. He persuaded a field hand to remember the date of a delivery, and a maid to recollect the pallor of Don Ricardo's face on a certain night.
These small recollections, when pooled, began to make a mosaic that no one man could easily deny. Don Emilio's arrival at the manor was understated but effective. He did not come with soldiers, only with a mandate and a presence that said the law is not idle. He requested a meeting with Don Ricardo and with witnesses. He asked for ledgers to be made available and for servants to be given space to speak without fear. Don Ricardo received him with the expression of a man who had expected obedience and had instead found application.
Yet his composure suggested a man who thought he had prepared for such an eventuality. He had not. He had prepared a paper fortress, but had not counted on the number of voices that could mount a chorus against him. The verification process was not instant. Don Emilio sifted through accounts, compared signatures, checked dates. He brought with him a clerk who knew how to match handwriting and find the idiosyncrasies that betray a forged explanation. He listened to Mateo's account, cleaned by fear and polished in loyalty. And then he went to the tavern to speak to a host who had once been called upon to bear a message. Piece by piece, the net tightened. Yet there was one legal thing Don Ricardo could not anticipate. Human memory kept more than he thought. Pilar, the pantry woman with the long patience and the stubborn heart, had kept a scrap of paper wrapped inside a towel for reasons she could not at first explain. It was a faint scrap, yellowed and folded, but when Don Emilio took it into his dependable hands, he saw, beneath the crease, a notation that matched a payment ledger and the flourish of Don Ricardo's hand. He held the scrap like a kind of relic, and then he asked for a search of the study. The search, when it happened, was methodical and unromantic. Don Ricardo protested and used the kind of bland, officious language he favored, but Don Emilio had the legal right and the weight of reason behind him. In a paneled room that had seemed to belong to the dead, they found a small jam jar beneath the false bottom of a drawer. Inside was a rolled page, the last page of the ledger they thought had been burned. And although half of it had been scorched, the margin bore entries and signatures that could not be erased. The charred edges smelled of the hearth, and Don Ricardo's face went momentarily human, as if he recognized his own small hand in the guilt. The arrest that followed was not a spectacle, but a quiet, efficient undoing. Don Ricardo was taken with the kind of dignity that suits a man who has always believed his position would protect him. His possessions were catalogued, his denials filed into a mouth that made them tidy. The house, which had been a theater of partial evils, closed in around him like hands closing a book. Alejandro, who had been in the basement and who had kept his will honed into words, was brought up to stand in the light again. He walked as a man who had emerged from a cave, slow, blinking, reorienting. He saw Isabela in the room, standing slightly behind Don Emilio, and his face changed in a way that felt like a confession. He did not speak at first. He allowed the world to name itself, watched the steward's face changing with each item found and placed into evidence. When Alejandro finally did speak, he did not speak in the register of sentiment. He spoke with the honest gravity of a man who had been given back to himself. "This woman," he said, and his hand found Isabela's as naturally as a compass finds north, stood where others would have looked away. She made herself small in a house of measurement and became larger than how they called her. The words were not a decoration, but a fact placed like a stone on the evidence table. Don Ricardo received the rebuke as a man constrained first by protocol and then by the small, sharp sense of shame that comes when a well-planned life is undone by truth. He tried, as men of his manner often do, to argue technicalities, but the ledger fragments, Mateo's testimony, Pilar's scrap, and the insistence of Don Emilio were like a legal muscle that would not relax. The household watched in an odd silence as the man who had been the architect of their cold routine was led away with a dignity he could not afford to keep.
There were consequences beyond the arrest. The Valbuena family, who had once traded Isabela for the sake of survival, found their own actions returned to them like an unpaid debt. The town's magistrate, informed and unimpressed, demanded that debts arranged under false pretenses be revisited. Catalina's suitor, who had expected an easy alliance strengthened by a morally pliant family, found his interest cool in the light of scandal. Isabela's mother, who had folded her hands the night they traded a daughter to secure others, found herself with fewer polite nods from neighbors and more pointed silence. For Isabela, the reversals were not only social but deeply personal. She had left the Valbuena house believing her role in life was to be small and exchangeable. When public vindication arrived, it did not erase the sound of the carriage door closing behind her the first time, but it returned to her a sense of agency. Alejandro's gesture of recognition, the way he credited her in public, not as a trophy, but as the cause of his return to will, unbuckled something taut in his chest. He stepped to her with a simplicity that did not require grand speech. "You taught me how to be present," he said. "You taught me how to be found." His fingers, roughened by the ledger and the house's dark work, took hers in a way that made the world smaller and better. The house itself began to change. Curtains that had been drawn for years were unsnapped. The piano, neglected for too long, was tuned by a man who did the act with a quiet reverence rather than show. Rooms breathed differently, with no sinister ledger at their core. Isabela, who had learned to place cups with precise kindness, now arranged flowers in the parlor in a way that suggested she had always belonged there. The single rose in the garden, lonely, stubborn, began to be tended, pruned, and moved to a place where sunlight could reach it. Its bloom, when it opened, was a small scandal of color against the manor's hush. Love, if anyone wanted to call it that, did not rush them. Alejandro, who had been living in a slow unmaking for years, learned to stand tall by degrees.
Isabela, who had been taught to shrink, learned to accept a place at his side not as a prize but as a partner. Their courtship was a continued practice. Piano lessons that ended in laughter, walks in the garden where they spoke of the future in practical terms, repairs that needed to be ordered, letters that should be written to ensure fairness across the tenants, and a promise that the house would no longer be a place of secrecy. Don Emilio's presence remained for a time like a stabilizing thread. He advised Alejandro on financial matters and with a quiet firmness helped put in place the legal mechanisms that would prevent another man like Don Ricardo from extinguishing the estate's integrity. He was not a romantic figure. His hand was steady, his reasoning solid. He would, as the months passed, become a friend who set the estate's paperwork in order and taught Alejandro that guardianship is not only about holding keys, but about keeping accounts with fairness. Mateo's role earned him not only gratitude, but advancement. The late master's memory, which had been a soft obligation in Mateo's bones, now aired in small rewards. He was given official status in the household records, and more importantly, his sister's dowry was provided for from the corrected accounts. In the slot of his heart where devotion had lived as memory, recognition now settled like a coin placed on a table and not forgotten. Isabela's family did not all perish from shame. Not every compact dissolves under disgrace, but they did lose the freedom to ignore consequences. Her mother found odd kindness from those who had once looked away, and Catalina learned that the economy of advantage required a conscience. Don Ramiro's alignment with a man who could be disgraced left him with fewer alliances. The Valbuena household learned, in slow increments, to reckon with the moral cost of their bargains. The public scene that sealed much of what had been mended was simple rather than theatrical. Don Ricardo's trial was not a spectacle of screaming accusations. It was an administrative dissolution of a man's maneuvering.
Evidence piled quietly and logically, and the outcome, arrest, restitution, was not an ecstatic triumph but a sober correction. In the hearing, Alejandro did not only list wrongs, but told of small mercies that had saved his life. A cup on a sill, a lullaby, a woman who would not stay small so another could remain large. After the legal tides had run, there was a smaller moment, unscripted, that mattered to both of them. They stood by the piano one morning, the curtains thrown open, and the house full of a light that had been absent for some seasons. The rose bush outside trembled in a breeze. The garden had been tended into a respectable disorder. Alejandro stepped close and took Isabella's hand. "I considered myself broken," he said, the admission not for anyone but for her. "I thought that grief would fossilize me. You made me want to be more than the shape of my sorrow."
Isabella's reply was not a coquettish line, nor a grand profession. It was the same thing she had told him the first night, only now the words were worn smooth and full of meaning. "Because no one should suffer alone," she said, "but also because no one should be left to be defined by how other people measure them." They kissed, not in a sudden, fevered way, but as two people who had practiced gentleness find that their steps match. The kiss was an agreement, a modest vow that the work of restoration would be mutual. Their hands lingered on each other's faces with a familiarity that promised patience rather than urgency. Their marriage was not an immediate decision. They arranged things as they had arranged small repairs, in conversations that measured finances and roles, in consultations with Don Emilio, and in visits to tenants whose confidence they wished to restore. They aimed for a union of equals in the measured world they were rebuilding. Alejandro as steward, who would be present and accountable, Isabela as mistress, who would oversee not only the house's comforts but its justice. On a quiet afternoon, in the walled garden where the rose that had started it all now bloomed with a full, unashamed crimson, Alejandro knelt in the dirt and in a manner that had none of the pomp of learned men, but all of the sincerity of someone who had been rescued, proposed. He spoke of simple things, shared tea in the mornings, music on rainy days, vows to keep accounts both financial and moral. Isabela laughed and answered with the only honest thing she had to offer. "I will be with you when the ledger becomes truth and when it fails." They married with few guests, among them Mateo, Pilar, Don Emilio, and the servants who had become their chosen family. The consequences for Don Ricardo were measured and, in their fairness, restorative rather than vindictive. He was obliged to repay what he could. He lost the confidence not to his character, but to a court that required proof. The manor's books were corrected, debts extended in ways that would not starve the tenant farmers, and the house, under Alejandro's steadier direction, became a place where accounts matched reality. In time, Isabela's family learned to be smaller in the ways that mattered less. Catalina found work in town managing a small mercantile stall. Their mother took pleasure in the mornings knitting in the window rather than counting coins by lamplight. They arrived at a modest reconciliation with Isabela, not because they had paid penance in the public sense, but because life, being stubborn and pragmatic, finds new arrangements to survive. 6 months after Don Ricardo's removal, the manor looked like a place that had taught itself kindness. The curtains were lighter now. Where once the heavy drapery had hung like a judgment, now lace was draped to gather the sun and let it perform its ordinary work, to warm the piano, to dry the tea towels, to shine on a small bowl where the house's coins were counted, honestly, at the end of the day. The rose in the walled garden had more companions, a scraggly patch planted by Isabela and Mateo, each bloom a deliberate act of defiance against the idea that the garden belonged only to the past. Mateo moved, at Isabela's insistence and Alejandro's gratitude, to be a formal steward of the grounds.
His sister's life improved because a misapplied ledger had been returned to its proper calculation. The harvests were shared more fairly, and a stable that had been a place of small anxieties became a hub of fair trade and steady work. They kept the piano where it was, and Alejandro learned to play not for crowds, but for the content of quiet Sunday afternoons. Isabela would sit, her fingers tracing the edge of the keys, and he would play a shaky bar or a firm chord. Their lullaby, her grandmother's song, became a part of that domestic music. It passed at first like a secret on a single note, then grew into a refrain that the house began to recognize as part of its new order. There were moments, rare and sharp, that reminded them how fragile anything rebuilt could be. A tenant would press a worry in Alejandro's hand about rent, and he would answer not with the cold arithmetic his uncle favored, but with the slow, practical compassion he and Isabela had built together. Once a man came to plead for a small grace because his child was ill. Alejandro turned to Isabela, and they made a decision together, as equals, to forgive a season of debt and to help pay for medicine. The man walked away with a tear and a handshake. The house grew a little more honest in the doing. Isabela, for her part, continued to be surprised at how often her perceived weakness, her habit of listening, of refusing to raise herself high enough to be seen as dangerous, was the precise tool the house needed. When a storm came and a tree fell against the roof, it was not a show of force that saved them, but the neighborhood's willingness to help because they knew the heirs were people who remembered debts of kindness. Her steadiness had become an additive in the community's ledger and not merely a personal virtue. In a room upstairs where the light pooled like honey, Alejandro kept a small box. Inside were the pieces of the ledger that could not be burned, the charred scrap Pilar had hidden, the copy Isabela had made and preserved like a talisman, and a folded note written in Alejandro's shaky hand that said simply, "By memory and courage, truth returned." He would, when he was alone, touch the paper like a relic and thank in his own silent way the woman who had refused to be less than she was. On a late spring morning, the house resembled the small domestic utopias Isabela had imagined when she hummed the lullaby at the river as a child. Curtains moved in an arranged choreography with the breeze. The garden had been replanted with vegetables alongside the roses, practicality and beauty holding hands. Children were allowed to play within sight and not shooed away by the memory of a man who had once been dangerous in people's imaginations. The piano played a hesitant sonata as Alejandro taught a neighbor's girl how to find a tune. Isabela sat at a window that looked out on the garden and folded laundry with the unremarkable concentration of someone who knew that steadiness is a form of worship. Her hands moved in a pattern that had once been only a survival skill. Now it was a gesture of a mistress content in her role, to arrange things so they did not collapse into small cruelties. She thought, as she often did these days, of the night the carriage took her from the Valbuena house. She thought of the copper coins, the ledger, her grandmother's lullaby. She had, in that long arc, learned a different math, that small acts multiplied, that listening could lay the foundations for great repair, that perceived weakness is sometimes a false arithmetic meant to keep the patient and persistent from measuring themselves rightly. Alejandro came to the window carrying 2 cups of tea. His face had the patient geometry of a man who had rebuilt the lines of himself. He stood behind her and set a cup in her hand without a word. For a moment they watched the rose bush together, the same red bloom that had been their private token, now plain and unabashed among the green. "You thought you were weak," he said softly, leaning his forehead against the back of her head. "And you were used as though weakness were an accusation. But you taught me there is a kind of strength that hides itself under the work of making things gentle." She smiled, the kind of smile that held both of them without needing to push feelings into language. She placed a hand on his, and he turned, closing his fingers around hers. Their wedding band, a small ring of hammered gold, caught the sun and flashed like a coin, but held a different meaning. Not purchase, but promise. Outside, the manor's gate stood open for the first time in many seasons, no longer an iron snare, but an invitation. A peasant woman walked into the garden with a bundle of herbs and a child who laughed without the memory of fear. Servants moved freely, and laughter, soft, human, unembellished, came from the kitchen like a tide. Isabela thought of the title the world had once tried to pin on her, weak. It was, she understood now, a word used by people who needed to keep their own hearts small to protect them. She had been taught to be small. She chose instead to be constant.
Her constancy had, in the end, become the key that opened locked rooms, the song that woke speech, the small, steady hand that steadied a man no one else could reach. When the sun set that evening, casting a gold that made the rose look like a small fire, Alejandro and Isabela walked the garden together. Mateo walked behind them with a sack of seeds over his shoulder, and Pilar carrying a basket of fresh bread. Don Emilio stopped by sometimes to consult with a patient expression and then walked on. The life they had made was not grandiose. It was, by the honest measure of surviving enough to be kind, enormous. If this story moved you, leave a comment telling what you would have done in Isabela's place and share it with someone who believes in second chances.